Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. I am here today to talk to you about our topic this week, which is key phases of emergency management. So, the key phases of emergency management is something that we have been talking about or referring to intermittently for a number of months now. It's the key way that we think about emergency management in Australia, and I would argue even across other parts of the world. It's something that shapes everything that happens in emergency management, the way that we think about emergency management, and most importantly, the way that we do emergency management in different contexts. And you'll recognise the little diagram that I've got on the slide here that says, prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. Now, the way that these particular phases pan out is probably not quite as truly represented in this particular diagram. So it says, for instance, prevention and mitigation happens before, preparedness happens before, response happens during, and recovery happens after. But often these different sections will be intersecting in a lot of ways as well. So we'll talk more through these types of issues today. So what's the national framework in Australia? Very, very quickly. It is obviously aligns with that diagram that I just showed you with the four different parts to it. But the first part of it is kind of an intersection between two. So this is the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience model, which is PPRR, and that's the one that we follow across Australia. So it's the first P is prevention, but this also includes mitigation. So prevention and mitigation, then we have preparedness, then we have response, and then finally we have recovery. Each of these concepts mean different things, and they're different in certain ways. But as I said before, there is quite a lot of overlap depending on which area you're focusing on, which concept you're trying to learn about, all of those types of things. And in addition to that, we have this overarching idea in Australia of resilience, which is something that I've already introduced you to a few weeks ago now when we talked about key concepts and so forth. So I've got this little diagram on this slide here, but you can see that resilience is in the centre of it, and we've got community connectedness, risk and vulnerability, planning and procedures, and available resources, and all of these things intersect. And in the centre and the heart of these things is resilience, this notion of resilience. So the notion of resilience runs through all of these different phases that we're talking about today. But hopefully I'll be able to walk you through them and show you that they're different enough to consider in terms of a phased model. So what's prevention and mitigation then, and why do we think about these things as being part of the same phase, I suppose, in relation to emergency management or disaster management? These concepts are often linked as they are more or less meaning similar things. So, for instance, if we have a look at a couple of definitions, we've got a definition here of mitigation. It says this is a sustained action to reduce or eliminate the risks to people and property from such hazards and their effects. So sustained action to reduce or eliminate the risks to people and property. Okay, if we look at the word prevention, this is a different definition that comes from the Commonwealth of Australia document that we looked at quite recently as one of your readings. I think it's Handbook 9, if I remember correctly. Don't be relying on that memory though. Prevention measures seek to eliminate or reduce the impact of hazards and or reduce susceptibility to those hazards and increase the resilience of the community subject to the impact of those hazards. So we're talking about reducing and eliminating the risks to people and property in terms of mitigation. You can see here in prevention, we're seeking to eliminate or reduce the impact of hazards, susceptibility to them, increase resilience. So it's very, very similar in their meanings for these two particular terms. So for the purpose of this lecture and for this unit, we're thinking about prevention and mitigation together because that is the way that they think about it in Australia. Okay? So these concepts cover a whole range of a broad spectrum, I suppose, of actors and different types of activities as well when we talk about or think about prevention and mitigation in relation to emergency management. So, for example, we're thinking very broad here. You know, we've been talking for many weeks about how broad emergency management is and how complex emergency management is. This is one of the phases where you can most distinctly see that complexity coming to the fore. And it's often because of the point that I've got here, is that the people that are involved in it are often outside of traditional emergency management circles. So, for example, we're involving land use planners, construction and building officials, both public and private construction and building officials, not just public folks in that respect. We've got business owners, insurance companies, and community leaders, as well as people like politicians, also the media and so forth. All of these folks have a role in prevention and mitigation in some sense or another. And you can see that non-government organisations would also have a large role in this. At the moment in Australia, we have a whole range of different non-government organisations that do equally a whole range of different types of prevention and mitigation work with different local communities. Ultimately, these different processes, mitigation and prevention, require planning expertise, political acumen, marketing, public relations. So there's a whole vast array of different experiences here that come together to talk about or describe the activities that happen in prevention and mitigation. And I'll give you some examples in just a tick. So these guys are focused much more on the broader skill set that we think about when we think about emergency management, as opposed to the very operational based skill sets that we think about when we think about first responders and their roles in emergency management. So vastly different in a lot of ways. It's certainly that they definitely intersect, you know, first responders with other folks that are involved in prevention and mitigation, obviously, but to a certain extent, they are different in terms of the different skill sets. But let's have a look at this a little bit more now. So the activities that we have for prevention and mitigation, what are these and what do they look like? We've got things such as hazard-specific control programs. Now, these could come in a range of different forms, but one of the ones that we're most familiar with, I guess, in Australia, of course, and if you're all sitting in the classroom with me right now, I'd say, what's the most common form that you might see in everyday life? It's backburning, controlled burning, to try and stop bushfires. This is a really core part of the prevention and mitigation of bushfires around Australia, given that it's one of our greatest hazards in Australia at the moment. But you can also do things such as building flood levees in flood-prone areas, and you can do things that also relate to bushfire mitigation and prevention, installing automatic sprinkler systems that you can turn on in the event of a bushfire. Down here, you'll notice a lot of houses in more regional areas in Tasmania, when you're driving around, they have sprinkler systems on the roofs of their houses so that they can turn them on when the bushfires come through. Interestingly enough, that's connected with a whole range of other different processes. So something, for instance, that often doesn't work in the event of a bushfire, either because they've turned it off or because it's become compromised, is electricity supply. And electricity supply is often something we need in order to be able to run the sprinklers. So people will often set up even more sophisticated preventative measures on the site, where they have their own generator. It sits on site, they test it every now and then, and that generator is there in order to run the pumps on the farm when the electricity supply is cut off for whatever reason. So these are all examples of hazard-specific control programs that everyone is involved in, not just folks who live on their own properties, but also, putting in sprinklers in buildings and so forth to prevent major fires and deaths of people, etc., etc. Land use planning and building controls in legislation and regulations is really, really important. And I know it doesn't seem like a huge thing, but it's one of the most important things that we do in terms of preventing natural hazards in particular. So, for instance, we think about how we're going to build our houses if we live in a cyclone prone area. We think about how we might build our houses if we live in a flood prone area so that we're lifting our house off the ground, for instance. We also think about the different types of building codes and so forth, and what would need to be written into those building codes based on the geographical space or state or territory that we lived in and the types of natural hazards which are most common there. So all of those things are influenced in the process of prevention and mitigation. Quarantine and border control measures are also in place. For instance, in the event of the mad cow disease, and when we had an outbreak of that in certain parts of the world, people enforced very strict quarantine measures and border control measures around meat. In fact, it probably made it the most stringent processes that we now have in place as sort of standard as a result of that particular outbreak. But those types of measures are commonly rewritten depending on specific types of experiences. Another great example is when we had the terrorist attacks in September 11. They worked towards revising the ways in which passengers could take on certain amounts of liquids onto a plane and so forth. And we can see those changing quite often depending on what terrorist threats come about. Public health strategies are fairly straightforward, even just the simplest things like washing your hands after you've been to the toilet and so forth, or ensuring that if you've been for a bushwalk somewhere overseas and you're coming back to Australia, that you clean the bottom of your shoes. Just those little types of things which can stop the outbreaks of different types of viruses and bugs, in addition to stopping, cross-contamination of fire ants and so forth, for example. Community education and awareness is a really big one. This is probably not something that I need to go into a huge amount of detail with. There's a whole range of different types of community awareness strategies that we have around. One of the ones that I wanted to share with you this week that I think I might be able to put up online is this great online site called Dingo Creek. It's one that helps teach kids how to be prepared and so forth in relation to different types of hazards. But this community education awareness happens at all levels. It happens in schools, it happens in high schools, it happens in different workplaces, and of course different community members who volunteer their time to be part of SES and so forth. There's also things like hazardous material, safety and security initiatives around those forms of material that are put into place. For instance, you get fines if you're a large organisation and you're found to be dumping a whole bunch of waste into the water supply. You will be subject to various forms of fines, of course, because we're trying to protect the water supply that then therefore protects the health of the broader community overall. There's things like critical infrastructure protection and the different things that local governments and sometimes private businesses put into place to ensure that really critical infrastructure have backup plans and so forth. Everyone knows about what happens when a fire outbreak happens, all of those types of things. And ensuring that we provide the best possible protection for those forms of infrastructure. So a good example of this on a much smaller scale might be, a pretty critical form of infrastructure with a plane crash, for instance, is the black box. So they designed it in a way where, the black box records regardless of what's happening, and that black box is almost impervious to the intervention of an air crash. So it means that when it hits the ground, we can find the black box and we can listen to it and figure out what's happened with the plane, as long as the plane is locatable in some form. So that's what I mean by critical infrastructure protection. It's building certain sorts of protective measures in place to ensure that we're thinking ahead about natural hazards. So for instance, if a particular area is subject to flooding, a very common flooding, then we need to think of how we can build our infrastructure like schools and so forth in a way that brings them up above the levels of flooding so that we don't have to keep recovering, so that school doesn't have to keep recovering from a flood, for instance. Then there's different types of resilience programs, and again, this could involve a whole manner of different people depending on who it is and what they're doing. But generally looking at things like, going onto the website, finding a pamphlet, learning about resilience that way, as well as working on people being prepared, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Mass gathering safety and protection programs are pretty important. So often the Red Cross, for instance, will be part of this process where they will be working with local businesses as well as local government to come up with a particular space where people can be evacuated to. They provide them with the essentials of life in that space, and it ensures then that the people who have been victims of this particular natural hazard have a backup plan in that circumstance. And of course, ensuring access to publicly available geological and topographic mapping, earthquake and tsunami monitoring services, and so forth. So, for instance, the BOM, which is the Bureau of Meteorology, is something that we all use, I would argue, in the event of a cyclone, for instance. Cyclone Debbie recently happened in Australia, which was in far north Queensland. My brother lives in Queensland, so in Mackay in particular, and so I was constantly checking the BOM to look at the progress of the cyclone, to see when it was hitting land, to make sure that he was okay, kept checking in with him, all of that sort of stuff. But I was only able to do that and to chart the path of where the cyclone was going to go because of the BOM being available online. So making sure that people have information about that type of stuff is pretty important, particularly because if they have that local knowledge and they can combine that with that sort of official non-local knowledge we talked about, I think, very recently, maybe it was last week or the week before, I can't quite remember, but those joined together makes that person feel more confident in the event of a natural disaster and more confident helping family members and so forth. So all of these different things, this is what we think about when we think about prevention and mitigation. So we can see that prevention and mitigation then is pretty complex. There's a lot involved in it, and it's very broad, and there's so many different organisations involved in this process, or this phase, as it were. Because we're actually going to read an article this week which challenges that notion of a phased approach as well. So what are the key challenges then with prevention and mitigation? Because there's some pretty corker ones here that are fairly important overall. Some people and some organisations just generally deny the risk. For instance, what a really interesting example of this would be having a look at the current circumstance at Utah's, where they're moving their infrastructure and making a major campus out of Invermay, the area of Invermay. Now, Invermay is an area which really floods very commonly, and when it does, it's quite disastrous. It's on a disaster level scale where critical infrastructure is impacted across a particular area. You have to get other communities in order to support that community to rebuild and to recover and so forth. So a lot of people would perhaps ask, why on earth is Utah's building or trying to build critical infrastructure in a way which is based in Invermay, where flooding happens most commonly? It's because some organisations just deny the risk. They say, yes, we understand there's a serious risk there. The land and the buildings might be cheaper. That's where we're going. It's really quite remarkable, but that is a common concern in relation to prevention and mitigation with emergency management. Politicians are also focused on short-term goals because they have an often a 3-yearly cycle at the most, when prevention and mitigation actually is not short-term at all. It's actually quite long-term. So if we get a government in who's really passionate about prevention and mitigation in certain areas, then they'll be doing more work in some areas and than in others, right? But if then that government gets taken away and the funding for prevention and mitigation just disappears, there's literally nothing that can be done about that. The government controls those processes completely. So Prevention and mitigation often requires that really long-term investment, and it needs to be consistently invested in by governments over a long period of time. But that comes in direct tension with that very short turnaround that we see in governments at the moment. Increasing costs is a no-brainer. A lack of funding and resources generally will obviously, ironically, mitigate the ways in which we can do, or if it's possible to do, prevention and mitigation generally in the community. And of course, the final issue with prevention and mitigation involves taking on the issue. Sometimes, in order to prevent a natural hazard from being a major disaster in the future for someone, they really need to get another organisation on board. A great example of this would be what happened in the floods. I know I use this very often, but this was one that I had some personal contact with, so I know quite a lot about. The folks talked about how in the event of the flood and being flood affected, they found that certain types of funding was available and certain types of funding was not available depending on where they lived, depending on what type of words they used to describe. So if they used the word inundation, then their insurance would pay out, but if they said their house was flooded, then they said, well, you're not covered for flood, so we can't pay you. And even though that might be part of the response and recovery process, it's also about prevention and mitigation down the track. So these people have been left with no insurance money in order to rebuild their houses. So they need to take then, the insurance company or whatever it is to court. They have to take on the issue in order to ensure that prevention and mitigation is a success, and to ensure that they can rebuild their house and so forth, so that they can avoid that particular hazard in the future. Not necessarily avoid, but certainly prepare for it as best that they possibly can. So following up damages and costs through the courts can be a big thing, where genuinely, if someone is absolutely exhausted emotionally and otherwise because of that natural hazard that they've been a victim of, then they're very unlikely to take on the issue and push it forward.